Vanessa Whitlock stood in front of my workshop holding a suspension order like it was a weapon, and she called me a useless man who hoarded scrap metal in his backyard. I had not said a single word back to her when her son's wheelchair locked up halfway down the slope behind her, the motor whining, then grinding, then tilting hard toward the drainage ditch. Vanessa screamed my name like I was suddenly the only competent person on the planet. At Nolan's request, not hers, I wheeled the chair into my shop, pulled the side panel, and found a part that had not simply failed. It had been swapped. And once I understood what that swap meant, I knew it could end her presidency for good. Briar Glen was the kind of neighborhood built to look finished the day the last truck left. The lawns were cut to the same height on the same Thursday every week, the mailboxes were painted the same shade of slate gray, and the entrance gates were white stone that gleamed even in the rain. My workshop sat at the edge of all that, on land my father had owned since before anyone drew a single line for Briar Glen on a map. I fixed generators, welded broken fence posts, and helped more than one new homeowner get a mower running again, without ever charging them a dime. None of that mattered to Vanessa. To her, the workshop was a stain on a painting she believed she had commissioned herself. At my first homeowners meeting, she stood at the podium and looked directly at me while she spoke about men who confused knowing how to use a wrench with actually contributing something to a community. She said it with a smile, the kind of smile people use when they know no one in the room will challenge them. I did not challenge her either. I simply wrote her words down, word for word, in the small notebook I keep in my shirt pocket, because in my experience, people like Vanessa eventually forget what they have said out loud in a room full of witnesses. A few weeks later, she unveiled her plan for a new West Gate, a project she priced at just over $1,200,000, complete with imported stone and decorative lighting. The access road for that gate ran directly along the service lane beside my workshop. She never mentioned that detail during her presentation. I only noticed it myself when I studied the site plan she had posted in the community office, and I saw my own property line marked in red as land to be, in her words, reclaimed for future development. The notices started arriving within a week of that meeting, one after another, each one stamped with the HOA seal like it carried the weight of law. My sign was the wrong color. My roll-up door was an eyesore. My tools made noise that exceeded some limit nobody had ever actually measured. Cars belonging to customers were parked on the service road. Metal bins I used for scrap were labeled industrial waste in a newsletter sent to every household in Briar Glen. Every notice came with a photograph taken from a distance, angled just right to make 30 years of honest work look like a junkyard. My father built that shop with his own hands back when this stretch of land was still bordered by fields instead of decorative fencing, and I grew up learning the smell of hot metal and cutting oil before I ever learned to ride a bicycle. When the developers came through and started laying out streets named after trees that had never grown here, my father sold them everything except the workshop and the half-acre it stood on. And he made sure that agreement was written down properly, because he never trusted a handshake with a man in a suit. I inherited that same instinct, along with the shop, and it turned out to matter more than either of us could have guessed at the time. People in Briar Glen mostly left me alone in the early years, curious but polite, the way people are curious about anything that does not quite fit the pattern around it. A few of them became regular customers, bringing in lawnmowers, pressure washers, the occasional antique bicycle someone had inherited from a grandfather. I never charged extra for being the only repair shop within walking distance of a gated community, and I never advertised because word traveled well enough on its own. Vanessa moved in 3 years before any of this started, and from the very first week, she treated the workshop the way some people treat a stain on a white carpet, something to be scrubbed out or covered over rather than understood. Some of those notices arrived with fines attached before I had even been given a chance to respond, and one letter threatened a lien against a property that had never technically fallen under the HOA's jurisdiction in the first place. I called the property manager about that particular error, a soft-spoken man named Grant, who always sounded apologetic on the phone, and he admitted quietly that Vanessa had instructed him to process the paperwork regardless of jurisdiction and let the homeowners sort it out afterward if they objected. That told me everything I needed to know about how deliberate this campaign actually was, and it told me Vanessa understood most people would rather pay a fine than fight one. In that same newsletter, Vanessa wrote a line about certain homeowners who took everything from the community and gave nothing back. She'd ever used my name, but she did not need to. At the next meeting, I brought the original land use permit my father had filed more than 3 decades earlier, the one that predated the HOA by a full generation. Vanessa glanced at it for exactly 2 seconds, then told the room that old paperwork could not be allowed to stand in the way of progress. She gave me 7 days to shut the workshop down voluntarily, or she would begin formal proceedings to force the issue. Nolan appeared beside her for the first time at that meeting, sitting quietly in his wheelchair near the front row. He was a grown man, 31 years old, a graphic designer who worked from home and clearly did not enjoy being paraded in front of a room. I noticed the discomfort on his face every time his mother gestured toward him, while talking about how Briar Glen had invested tens of thousands of dollars to become, in her words, a model of accessibility for the whole region. I also noticed something else. To reach his seat, Nolan had to steer around a section of sidewalk with a slope so steep his chair strained visibly against the grade. On the 7th day of the deadline, Vanessa arrived at my workshop with the HOA property manager, trailing behind her and a phone already raised to record the moment. She wanted a photograph of me accepting the suspension order for the community bulletin, proof that she had finally handled the problem she had been complaining about for months. She told me, in front of both of them, that I was a man clinging to a pile of scrap because I had nothing else in his life to be proud of. I did not argue. I never do when someone is trying to provoke a reaction they can use later. The afternoon was warm and still, the kind of quiet that settles over a place like Briar Glen right before something goes wrong, with nothing but the low hum of a distant lawn service and the smell of fresh asphalt drifting up from the resurfaced road behind us. Vanessa had positioned herself just close enough to the workshop door to get the lighting right for her photograph, and Grant stood a few feet behind her, holding a clipboard he never once looked down at. I remember thinking, in that strange half-second before everything changed, that I had never seen her look so satisfied with herself. That was when Nolan started down the slope beside the workshop, and the front right wheel of his chair began shaking hard enough that I heard it from 15 feet away. A sharp metallic crack followed, and the wheel assembly dropped out of alignment, tilting the entire chair toward the drainage ditch that ran along the edge of the property. Nolan cut the power himself before anyone else could react, and he told everyone calmly not to pull or push the chair until he understood what had happened. Vanessa's composure disappeared instantly, and she called my name in a voice that had nothing left of the woman who had insulted me 30 seconds earlier. I brought a mobile lift from inside the shop and stabilized the frame before I touched anything else, and I asked Nolan directly whether he wanted me to look at the mechanism. He said yes without hesitation, which surprised his mother more than it surprised me. Vanessa wanted to call the manufacturer's roadside service, but their line quoted a wait of several hours, and Nolan could not sit exposed on a slope near a drainage ditch for that long. He agreed to let me bring the chair inside my shop, and for the first time since I had met her, Vanessa did not argue with a decision that involved me. Under the fluorescent lights of my workbench, I found the load-bearing bolt sheared clean through, and the metal grain did not match anything I recognized from the manufacturer's approved parts. When I wiped the grease away from the bolt head, I saw that the serial stamp had been deliberately filed down, not worn away by use, but removed on purpose by someone who did not want it identified later. That single detail told me this was not ordinary wear. Someone had put a part into that chair that was never meant to hold Nolan's weight, and someone else had made sure nobody could trace where it came from. Inside the shop, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and I could hear Nolan's breathing settle from the sharp, controlled rhythm of someone managing a scare down to something closer to normal. Vanessa hovered near the doorway, arms crossed, glancing at her phone every few seconds as though she were calculating how this delay might affect whatever plan she had for the rest of her afternoon. I asked Nolan if he wanted her to wait outside while I worked, mostly for his comfort, and he told me it did not matter either way, which I understood was its own kind of answer about their relationship. I told Nolan I had spent 8 years as a certified technician for adaptive mobility equipment before I took over my father's shop, and my certification still covered emergency mechanical inspection, even though I no longer worked for a large company. I made it clear this would only be a temporary emergency repair, and that the chair still needed a full inspection at an authorized service center as soon as possible. Vanessa scoffed at that, saying a man who lived in what she called a toy shop could not possibly understand equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars. Nolan told her flatly to let me work. I pulled the wheel assembly apart piece by piece and laid each component on a clean cloth so nothing could be argued about later. The load bolt was cheap carbide steel, nothing close to the aerospace-grade alloy the manufacturer specified. The bushing had been hand-filed down until it barely fit the housing. The mounting bracket carried an old hairline crack that someone had painted over rather than replaced, and the safety inspection sticker had been applied directly over a layer of undisturbed dust, which meant that bracket had never actually been removed for inspection at all, no matter what any paperwork claimed. Nolan told me the chair had been serviced 3 weeks earlier by a company called Summit Adaptive Solutions, the HOA's preferred vendor for anything related to accessibility. He pulled up the invoice on his phone right there in the shop, and it listed a full replacement of the entire bracket assembly using genuine manufacturer parts, billed at a price that assumed premium components throughout. I installed a temporary bracket from my own inventory, one rated for the correct load, and had Nolan test the chair at low speed across the shop floor. The system held steady, no shaking, no drift, nothing close to what had happened outside minutes earlier. Vanessa did not thank me for any of it. Instead, she told me that if the chair failed again in the future, I would be the one held responsible, since I was the one who had touched it without her permission. Nolan turned his own phone camera toward his mother before she finished the sentence, and he said clearly, for the recording, that he was the one who asked me to help and that she had no authority to rewrite what had actually happened. I sealed the broken bracket and bolt in an evidence bag, wrote the date and time on the label, and asked Nolan to sign it as the equipment owner before anyone left the shop. Vanessa's eyes fixed on that bag the moment she saw me seal it, and for the first time since she had walked onto my property that morning, her voice changed from contempt to something closer to alarm. She asked me, almost too quickly, to hand the bag over to her for safekeeping. I told her the equipment belonged to Nolan, not to the Homeowners Association, and that I would only release it to him or to a licensed inspector. She did not push further in front of witnesses, but I saw the calculation running behind her expression, the same look I imagined she wore when she first decided the workshop had to disappear. 2 days later, Nolan came back to the shop alone, without his mother, driving himself down the service road in a loaner chair while the repaired one sat in the trunk of his car. He brought a folder with him, invoices, warranty paperwork, and photographs he had taken of the chair before that last service appointment. He told me this was not the first strange incident since Summit Adaptive had taken over his maintenance contract. The armrest had loosened twice in 6 months. The battery had been swapped for a lower capacity unit without his consent. A stability warning light had come on more than once, and the company had dismissed it as a minor software glitch rather than checking the hardware. He also told me something that explained a lot about the tension I had felt in that first meeting. Vanessa regularly used his image in Briar Glen's promotional material, describing the community as a model of accessibility for people with disabilities. In reality, several of the ramps were too steep to navigate safely, the automatic gate near the clubhouse jammed more often than it worked, and decorative planters blocked at least 2 designated accessible paths near the pool. Nolan had complained about all of it privately for over a year, and each time his mother told him to stop raising the issue because Summit Adaptive was sponsoring the HOA's annual gala. Nolan sat across from my workbench that afternoon and talked more openly than he had during either of our previous encounters, telling me his accident had happened almost 6 years earlier in a highway collision that had nothing to do with anything happening now. He said he had spent the better part of those 6 years learning exactly how his equipment worked, because his safety depended on understanding it better than anyone servicing it ever would. His mother, he explained, had reacted to that accident by trying to control everything around him instead of asking him what he actually needed, and that pattern had never really stopped. It had simply changed shape over the years, moving from hospital visits and doctor consultations into HOA newsletters and gala sponsorships, but the underlying instinct to manage him rather than listen to him remained exactly the same. I told him plainly that I did not want to become a weapon in a dispute between him and his mother, and that I would only continue looking into the equipment if he was the one formally requesting it, not because his mother had wronged him personally. He agreed without hesitation, and together we compared the part numbers on his invoice against the manufacturer's official parts catalog. The number listed corresponded to a premium reinforced bracket assembly, one that cost several times more than the flimsy component that had actually been installed in his chair. I brought in my neighbor, Avery Sloan, a former insurance accountant who had already crossed paths with Vanessa over something as small as a mailbox painted the wrong shade of gray, a dispute that had somehow escalated into a formal violation notice and a threatened fine of $200 a month until the box was repainted to code. Avery had spent 20 years reading financial statements for a living before she retired to Briar Glen, and she told me the moment she saw the HOA's public disclosures that something about the accessibility line items looked wrong long before she found any specific proof. She said large invoices with vague descriptions were the first thing any auditor learns to distrust, and Summit Adaptive's paperwork was full of exactly that kind of vagueness. Phrases like general accessibility improvements and miscellaneous safety upgrades, standing in for any real itemized breakdown of the work performed. Avery pulled the HOA's publicly available financial disclosures and found that Summit Adaptive Solutions had received more than $86,000 over 2 years for accessibility upgrades across the community. Most of those payments had been approved by the HOA treasurer, Owen Rusk, and then signed off by Vanessa herself without any independent verification of the completed work. That same evening, I received a formal letter from the HOA's attorney demanding that I stop referencing the association's name in any capacity and immediately surrender, in their words, any property belonging to a resident currently in my possession. The letter never mentioned that the property in question was a broken bracket that had nearly injured a grown man on a public slope, or that the resident himself had asked me to keep it. It was clear Vanessa understood exactly how serious that piece of metal could become if it ended up in the wrong hands, and she was doing everything she could to make sure it ended up in hers instead. Vanessa's next move was a community-wide email describing what she called an unauthorized technician who had tampered with a resident's medical equipment without proper credentials or consent. She never mentioned that Nolan had asked for my help directly, and she never mentioned that his chair had already failed before it ever crossed the threshold of my shop. A few longtime customers canceled appointments out of caution, and my insurance carrier called asking for a full explanation of what had happened and why. Rather than react with anger, I sent them everything I had documented. Video from the moment the wheel failed outside my shop. A recorded verbal consent from Nolan before I touched the chair. My old technician certification, still valid for emergency mechanical inspection. Photographs from every stage of the temporary repair. A signed head statement confirming the work was intended only as a short-term stabilization measure, and a written recommendation that the chair be inspected by an authorized dealer as soon as possible, which Nolan had already scheduled on his own. The insurance representative assigned to my case, a careful woman named Denise, who asked precise questions and rarely repeated herself, spent nearly 2 hours on the phone with me going through every photograph and every timestamp in my records. She told me most claims like this one collapsed under contradiction somewhere in the details. A missing minute here, an inconsistent account there, but mine held together cleanly from the moment the wheel failed to the moment Nolan signed the evidence bag. My insurance carrier concluded within days that I had followed appropriate emergency procedure and found no evidence of negligence on my part. Meanwhile, Nolan had sent the broken bracket to an independent testing lab under his own name, and the results confirmed what I already suspected. The steel used in that bracket could withstand less than half the load rating required by federal accessibility equipment standards, which meant it had been a matter of time, not chance, before it failed under his weight. I went back through the HOA's public financial reports myself and noticed something Avery had missed on her first pass. The budget line allocated for accessible ramp repairs had been quietly reduced by almost the exact amount that had been added to the proposed budget for the new West Gate. Avery dug further into the paperwork the following week and discovered that the owner of Summit Adaptive Solutions was Owen Rusk's brother-in-law, a relationship that had never been disclosed anywhere in the bidding documents the HOA had filed for that contract. Vanessa kept dismissing me publicly as an angry man who could not stand being told what to do by a successful woman. I never responded to that in kind. Instead, I quietly submitted everything I had gathered to the county safety inspector and to the HOA's own insurance provider, letting the paperwork speak in a way my words never could against her. A woman named Mara Keene, the county's building safety inspector, contacted me a few days later and said she planned to attend the next scheduled homeowners meeting, though she asked me not to share the reason with anyone beforehand. Vanessa called a special session of the Homeowners Association, certain she could end the entire controversy in front of the whole community before it grew any further. She projected photographs of my workshop onto the screen behind her, choosing the least flattering angles she could find, and described me to the room as a danger to property values, a man without proper qualifications who enjoyed playing hero, a selfish landowner obstructing legitimate community development, and someone who had exploited her son's accident purely to strike back at the HOA. She asked the board to approve increased fines against me and to authorize legal action forcing the demolition of my shop. The clubhouse meeting room was full that night, folding chairs packed shoulder to shoulder, more residents than I had ever seen attend a single HOA session before. Vanessa had clearly counted on that crowd to make her case for her, believing a full room would pressure the board into siding with her rather than risk public embarrassment. I sat near the back with a folder of my own resting on my knee, the same evidence I had already submitted to the county and to the insurance company, organized in the order I intended to present it if given the chance. I stood up when she finished, but I did not respond to any of the insults directly. I asked her 3 questions instead. Whether Summit Adaptive had actually replaced the bracket assembly listed on their invoice. Why the part number on that invoice did not match the actual component installed in her son's chair. And why the HOA had continued paying Summit Adaptive without ever disclosing Owen Rusk's family relationship to the company's owner. Vanessa refused to answer, insisting I had no standing to speak about equipment belonging to her son. At that exact moment, Nolan wheeled himself into the meeting room under his own power, without his mother's assistance and without her knowledge that he was coming. He told the board plainly that the chair was his property, the invoices were his records, and the formal complaint being reviewed by the county had been filed by him and no one else. He played a short video clip on the projector screen, the same recording from days earlier, showing his mother demanding, "I hand over the broken bracket the instant she realized its serial number had been deliberately removed." An independent lab report followed, confirming that Summit Adaptive had installed substandard components in Nolan's chair while billing the HOA for premium manufacturer parts. Vanessa tried to cut the power to his microphone, but several board members openly told her to let him finish. It was the first time in that entire meeting that anyone had told her no, and I could see on her face that she had not expected it, not from her own board, and certainly not because of the son she had spent months turning into a symbol for her own agenda. I had met Mara only once before that night, when she came by my shop the week prior to review the documentation I had submitted to the county, and I remembered how carefully she avoided offering any opinion on Vanessa or the HOA at that time. She told me then that her job was to follow evidence wherever it led, not to take sides in neighborhood disputes, and she repeated almost the same words to the board that evening before she began reading through her findings. Nothing in her voice suggested triumph or vindication. Only the flat, methodical tone of someone reciting facts that had already been independently verified more than once. Mara Keene stood up next, accompanied by a representative from the HOA's insurance carrier, and made clear she had not come that evening because of a single wheelchair failure. A broader safety review had already been opened, and the results went far beyond what any of us in that room had anticipated. Multiple newly installed ramps failed to meet basic slope requirements. An automatic gate near the clubhouse had no functioning emergency release mechanism. Several designated accessible pathways had been narrowed by decorative landscaping installed after the initial inspection. Completion records for at least 3 projects used photographs taken from an entirely different property. Summit Adaptive had been paid in full for work that inspectors could find no evidence had ever been completed. Owen Rusk had never disclosed his relationship to the company he had personally recommended, and Vanessa had signed off on every completion certificate without requesting a single independent inspection. A portion of the accessibility budget, it turned out, had been quietly redirected toward the new West Gate, a project designed to raise property values specifically around Vanessa's own home while requiring use of the very service road that ran beside my shop. When challenged, Vanessa insisted she had done everything to protect the community's property values, and that rigid technical rules should not be allowed to stand in the way of what she called a larger vision for Briar Glen. Nolan asked her directly why she used his image to raise funds for accessibility while ignoring him whenever he said the equipment and pathways were unsafe. She had no real answer for that question, and instead turned her attention back to me, accusing me of manipulating her son into turning against her. Nolan cut her off immediately, saying I had never once asked him to do anything, and that it was her own behavior in the weeks after his accident that had pushed him to start questioning things for himself. The insurance representative announced on the spot that coverage for the West Gate project would be suspended until a full independent audit had been completed, a decision that effectively froze the project Vanessa had built her entire agenda around. Sensing that control was slipping away from her, Vanessa played what she believed was her final card. She declared that regardless of any financial questions raised that evening, my workshop remained an unauthorized commercial structure and had to be removed under the community's original bylaws. I had been waiting for her to say exactly that. I retrieved a copy of the founder's use rider, a legal addendum signed decades earlier when the original developer first purchased the surrounding land from my family. My father had kept the original copy of that rider in a fireproof lockbox for 30 years, tucked between his marriage certificate and the deed to the shop itself, and he had made me memorize exactly where it was long before I ever imagined I would need to produce it in a room full of people who wanted to pretend it did not exist. I had brought a certified copy with me that night, along with the county recording stamp proving it had been filed on public record decades earlier, so no one in that room could claim later that the document had been altered or invented for the occasion. That document guaranteed the workshop the right to continue operating indefinitely, required the adjoining service road to remain unobstructed at all times, prohibited the HOA from enacting rules specifically designed to force a lawful business to close, and required written consent from the property owner before any modification could be made to access routes affecting the workshop. Vanessa had received a copy of that rider years earlier, but she had deliberately kept it out of every meeting record and every filing related to the West Gate project. Internal emails later confirmed she had known about its existence long before she ever issued my suspension order. Mara confirmed on the spot that the West Gate project could never be approved as designed, since it directly violated the protected service road and had never received the written consent the rider required from me. The board, sitting in stunned silence, began to understand that the fines levied against me over the previous months were not just legally unfounded, but carried clear signs of deliberate retaliation. Vanessa tried to leave the meeting early, but the HOA secretary asked her to remain for an immediate vote of no confidence. When the votes were counted, only a single board member stood beside her. Avery called me 2 days after that meeting, sounding almost giddy in a way I had never heard from her before, telling me the county auditor had requested every financial record Summit Adaptive had ever submitted to the HOA going back 5 years, not just the 2 years we had originally examined. She said the scope of the investigation had grown well beyond a single wheelchair or a single gate project, pulling in questions about landscaping contracts and security system installations that had nothing directly to do with either Nolan or me. I told her I was not surprised, since people who cut corners on one thing rarely stop at just the one thing. Vanessa was suspended from the presidency pending the outcome of the county's financial and safety audit. Owen Rusk resigned before the board could formally remove him, and the HOA terminated its contract with Summit Adaptive Solutions within the week. The new interim board moved quickly, canceling every fine that had ever been issued against my workshop and reimbursing the legal fees and lost business income the ongoing campaign against me had caused. The Westgate project was scrapped entirely, and the board authorized an independent firm to inspect every pathway and access point across the community. The board also created a permanent safety committee, and to my surprise, they asked Nolan to chair it, a role he accepted without hesitation. Several members suggested making me the new public face of Briar Glen's accessibility initiative. But I declined, since I had no interest in letting the workshop become another tool for someone else's image campaign. The only arrangement I agreed to was practical, not symbolic. My shop would provide emergency mechanical inspections for residents whenever needed, but only at the direct request of the equipment owner and only with full documentation of every repair performed. I insisted on that last condition for my own protection as much as anyone else's, having learned firsthand how quickly a helpful act could be twisted into an accusation when the person telling the story controlled the narrative. Grant, the property manager who had once processed Vanessa's baseless lien threat without question, stayed on under the new board and told me privately that he intended to double-check every future order against the actual bylaws before sending anything out again. I appreciated the honesty, though I made a point of keeping my own records regardless of what anyone promised me going forward. At the following meeting, Vanessa was required to read a formal correction into the official record, stating that the Callaway workshop operated legally on protected land, and that I had provided emergency assistance to a resident when the HOA's own contracted vendor had failed to do so. She never called it an apology, and I never expected her to. But everyone sitting in that room understood exactly what those words meant, whether she was willing to say it plainly or not. The new safety committee met every other Tuesday in the clubhouse, and I attended a handful of those sessions myself whenever Nolan asked me to weigh in on something mechanical. It was strange at first, sitting in the same room where Vanessa had once tried to have my livelihood erased, now offering opinions that people actually wrote down and acted on. Nolan ran those meetings with a steadiness that reminded me of the calm he had shown the moment his own wheel first failed, never raising his voice, never needing to, because the facts he brought to the table were usually enough on their own to settle any argument in the room. One evening after a committee session, an older resident named Harold Petty stopped me in the parking lot and admitted he had voted in favor of every fine Vanessa proposed against my shop over the past year, simply because he had never questioned anything she told him. He apologized, a little awkwardly, and said he planned to bring his old table saw by sometime for a tune-up, as if that alone might settle the account between us. I told him there was nothing to settle, and that most people in Briar Glen had simply trusted the wrong person to tell them the truth, which was not the same thing as doing anything wrong themselves. Months passed, and the ramps throughout Briar Glen were rebuilt to proper specifications under independent inspection. The automatic gates were replaced with models that included functioning emergency releases, and every future accessibility contract now required a public bidding process free of hidden family connections. Nolan rode down to my shop one afternoon in his own chair, fully repaired by an authorized dealer this time, carrying a properly certified replacement bracket that he asked me to keep as a reminder of everything that had happened. He had also brought along a framed photograph of the two of us standing outside the shop the day the county closed its investigation, an image neither of us had planned to take, but that a passing reporter had captured anyway. I hung it near the workbench, not because I needed reminding of what happened, but because it felt right to keep some record of the moment things finally started to change for the better. I saw Vanessa only once more in any official capacity, at the meeting where she read her formal correction into the record, and I noticed she never once looked toward the back of the room where I was sitting. Nolan told me afterward that she had not spoken to him privately about any of it either. Not an apology, not an explanation, nothing beyond the practical logistics of dividing up whatever remained of her responsibilities on the board. I did not press him for more details, since it was not my place to referee whatever came next between a mother and her son, and he seemed to understand that distinction better than most people would have in his position. Vanessa resigned from the board entirely not long after that meeting, and she rarely appeared at any community event afterward. I never celebrated her downfall, and I still do not think of it that way even now. What I felt instead was something closer to relief, the simple relief of watching the truth stop being buried beneath polished newsletters and carefully angled photographs. Avery stopped by the shop that same week with a bottle of sparkling cider, since neither of us cared much for anything stronger, and we sat on overturned crates near the workbench, talking about how strange it felt for the whole ordeal to simply be over. She told me she still kept copies of every financial record we had pulled together, filed neatly in a drawer at home, not because she expected to need them again, but because old habits from 20 years of auditing were hard to shake. I told her I understood completely, since I still had every photograph and every signed evidence label from that first afternoon, stored carefully in the same drawer where my father used to keep his own records. I repainted the old sign above my shop door, but I left the scratches in the wooden frame exactly as they were, because those marks belong to the history of this place as much as anything else does. Nolan asked me one afternoon whether I still remembered the day his mother called me useless in front of half the neighborhood. I looked at the broken bolt sitting in its small glass case on my workbench before I answered him, turning the case slightly so the light caught the sheared edge of the metal, the same edge that had once nearly cost him far more than a bruised afternoon and a few weeks of paperwork. Some people only recognize the value of a craftsman the moment the thing they trusted most begins to break apart in their hands. The story ends the way it began, with the sound of my shop door rolling open. Not to fight anyone, not to prove anything to Vanessa Whitlock or the board that once tried to erase this place from the map, but simply to keep doing the work this workshop has always done, long before anyone in Briar Glen ever thought a piece of land like this one had any value at all.